You just do turn the knob. Yeah, see it here. I didn't see it.
Thank you. The second.
Why? You sleep on one side of the day.
What?
You sleep on one side of the day.
No, I sleep on my bed.
Oh, it's good.
Like a normal
It's
person.
good. But that's good practice.
Like a normal person.
I don't know, like do you mix with one side or the other?
No.
That's
Just like
weird.
this type of work.
That's weird. Maybe you should like when you get out of the shower, like put a pin so that it curls with it. Well, what if we'll get some? Yeah.
Nice.
People are doing like that. It's like when you see it's like on clouds. It's like.
It's fun. Right. The problem was.
She got on it.
Good. I'm fine. It said that they had spot there, they're not doing that. But I'm glad it's next time, but I hear like. We're gonna see. I like the idea that it's circular. So I'm kind of. I think the people are gonna do shows new English. To kind of be. You know, the thing that you say? No, I was going to, but then I just figured. Or they were I was, but if I know if I could have done that for my one already, because I was going to. So that's a problem. Yes.
Also, which project are you gonna do?
Didn't we, I'm not going to decide today.
Are you not doing the Oasis?
No, I'm in JD's.
What do you want Roxanne's?
No. Today I'd have to decide. It's like, or he's giving us five options, we just have to pick our bag.
Which one's are you?
What is it called in this one? And then I feel like anchor ones. And then this one for the operator. So I'm probably gonna do like the school job on my school bag, because we have to. I'll never do that.
I do know if they have like enough, like not for an example, like an entire program.
Oh, shit, zero, yeah. It's really exciting.
I doesn't went in there for. Try not to get it.
All right, it's 4 o'clock. Let's go and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Good. Hopefully everyone had a good long weekend. So it's a short week for us. So we only have just today's lecture and that's it. All right, so the plan for today is we're going to continue on with our lecture note for muscle biomechanics. I'm hoping we can finish it today, so that we can kind of move on to Joyce on Monday. Okay, so announcements. So remember homework 1 is due tonight. So it's all just conceptual questions. So we haven't gone over any kind of calculation stuff yet. And so they can all be answered just a few sentences. And so I think the only thing is that I want you to skip just the very, very last problem. Just because we'll go over today, but you know, going over something today and then have you do it for the homework tonight is a little bit too short of a turnaround. So I think you just have to do the first 10 questions. That's it. Okay.
The last one isn't in the homework one, no?
It's
We're giving that, right?
skipping it.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, skipping the last one. Okay, so I think that's about it. Not too many announcements. I'll post the next homework soon. Basically right after you guys have it ready. You just I don't want to post 2 homeworks at the same time. So once the due date has passed for this one, then I'll post the next homework so you can. All right, so I think that's it for my announcements. Are there any questions I can answer before we get started for today? Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and pick up where we left off. And so last time we were talking about muscle biomechanics. Oh, yeah, so I think hopefully the waitlist situation should be all resolved. So at least that's what the department has told me. So everyone that was on the waitlist should be in the class right now. So if you're still on the waitlist, let me know, and then we can kind of get that settled. The good thing is that we have exactly the right amount of people that fits the capacity of this group, so we don't have to move. And so that's kind of amazing. I was worried we might be 1 or 2 over, but looks like we'll be just perfect. Okay. Muscles, right? So last time we met up about a week ago on Wednesday, we were talking about bone. Right? Bones kind of give your body structure, their hard tissue, and they don't really, they're alive, but they don't really move much at all. Muscles are the opposite. So muscles are soft tissue, but they have this unique property that they can kind of contract on, so they can generate tension. And the primary role of muscles, because they're able to generate tension and kind of shorten themselves in length, they're the main way that your body uses to move around. Okay. All right. So last time, specifically, we were talking about kind of the properties of muscles. And so we said there are 4. So we went over the first two last time. The first one is extensibility. So extensibility is the ability for muscles to be stretched or to increase in length. And by that same token, they can also compress, you know, which is relevant when they contract on themselves. Okay. And the second property we went over was elasticity, which is the ability to return to its normal length if it is ever stretched or compressed. And so these two properties combined, remember, we call these kind of the passive elastic properties of muscle, right? And so with these two, you know, they don't act really any different than any kind of elastic solid that we are kind of familiar with in engineering, right? And so I think the analogy that we went over last time was a rubber band or any kind of rubber substance, right? And so for elastic solids, we know that if we ever kind of deform it, if we kind of stretch it, if we compress it, if we kind of twist it around, you know, what generates inside these muscles is these kind of you know, internal forces or internal elastic stresses, and these are the ones that actually try to return it to its normal. Okay. These two combined. These two combined are the passive elastic properties of muscle. Any other elastic solid will do the same. And we actually make use of this, right? And so remember last time we said that your body kind of inherently or you know intuitively kind of understands this property. So if you ever were to try to do any kind of big movement, like try to jump in the air, or you try to punch someone that said something mean to you, right? Kind of the natural thing is you try to wind up and kind of stretch the muscle so that you kind of get that extra boost from that elastic forces. Okay. Okay, so I think this is kind of where we left off last time. Are there any questions on this? Okay, all right, so let's talk about the two active properties of muscles. Okay. So these are kind of what we associate more with how muscles behave. Number three is irritability. And so irritability is a property of muscles where it can respond to stimulus. Okay. And so if you try to stimulate it either with an electrical signal or even just poking it sometimes, the muscle will actually respond. Right, and this property is really important because this is how your nervous system, or this is how your brain controls your muscles. And so your brain sends electrical signals down to your muscles, and those electrical signals cause your muscles to act. Okay. And so when your body needs your muscles to act, it sends an electrical signal, it originates in the brain, it travels through your nervous system, and once it gets to your muscles, then that causes the muscles to actually, twitch and actually contract. Okay. But you can also get muscles to respond in other ways as well. So if you, like I mentioned, if you poke a muscle, it'll respond. But I think more importantly, if you punch a muscle or kind of strike it, your muscle will kind of brace itself, it'll kind of, heal itself and respond to that injury. That's number 3, irritability. And then number 4 is the ability to develop tension, right? And so it's one thing for your muscle to actually respond to stimulus. It's another thing for them to actually do something about it, okay? And so once your muscles kind of receive that stimulus, receive a signal from the nervous system, then it then moves on to, to actually develop tension, and that tension is actually what moves your body. So number 4 is the one that's really unique to muscles, and because lots of different parts of your body are irritable, right? And so your nervous system can control a lot of different parts of your body, but your muscles are really the only tissue in your body that can actually take that signal and actually develop tension to move your body. Okay. And so in the next section, we're going to talk about exactly how that tension is actually developed in your muscles. Okay, any questions on this? Okay, all right. So let's talk about I kind of mentioned it here a little bit, but let's talk about these protein fibers. What they look like visually and how they're used to develop tension. Okay. Let's talk about the structural organization of a skeletal muscle. All right, so you've probably heard the term muscle fiber before. So muscle fiber refers to a single muscle cell. Muscle fibers are unique because usually when you think of cells in the human body or just anywhere, um, you know, they're usually kind of too small for you to see, but a muscle fiber is really just a very long fiber. And it's one of the biggest cells that you have in your body. Okay? And so a lot of these you can actually see with the naked eye, which is quite. Okay, and so around the muscle fiber, there is a membrane known as a sarcolemma, as well as kind of a fluid-like plasma inside the muscle called the sarcoplasm. And so, very similar to bones, where you need kind of a fluid to kind of transport nutrients and transport kind of chemicals around. Muscle fibers also need some kind of fluid suspension in order to move things around in the muscle. So that's what it's called. So that's kind of a little bit about kind of the macro structure of the muscle. So you have your muscles are made of muscle fibers. Inside the muscle fibers, you have these sarcoplasms and sarcolemma. Sarcoplasm is the fluid that's used to transport the nutrients. Okay. Okay. And so when you go kind of further down, when you go kind of more microscopic inside the muscle fibers, you're going to find all these kinds of protein filaments. Okay. And it's these protein filaments that are actually used to generate force for the muscles. Okay. All right, so let me draw the diagram for you, just so that you can kind of see it, and then we'll go ahead and label the different parts of the filaments. Let me use different colors for it. Okay. Okay. So this is kind of one set of protein filaments here. Okay. Let's put it in. This is probably the prettiest protein filament I've ever drawn in this dreamless class. So might as well finish it. Make it look nice. Okay. So you notice here we have two structures here, right? So we have the thing that's in red, obviously. So that's kind of the big one, and then actually the sheet around it, so the little kind of black brackets around it. That also is an important part of the protein. Okay. All right, and so in red here, we have what's known as myosins. Okay. Myosin is a type of protein filament. Sometimes you hear these be called the thick filament because visually they're thicker than the thin filaments. And then surrounding it are these kind of thinner actin filaments. And so these are sometimes called a thin. So thick and thin filaments. So the myosin are inside of the actin. All right, and so if you notice, the way I drew the myosin there, I've drawn all those little leaflets kind of facing outwards. Okay? And so what happens during contraction is that when your muscle wants to develop tension and it wants to contract, what's going to happen is that those leaflets are going to kind of pull the actin inwards. Okay? And so they're going to kind of basically straighten up, and it's going to kind of bridge that gap between them. Okay. And so that act of, it almost looks like almost think of it like a rowboat, right? And so, the rows are kind of, are gonna kind of, they start at an angle, and then when they pull, they're gonna come straighten up. That's gonna bring those two things together. Okay? And so in the end, you get something that looks like this. The gap will be significantly shortened. And so the overall length of both filaments actually gets shortened because the actins get pulled together by the myosin. Okay. So these protein filaments, normally are very, very difficult to see just because they're so microscopic. But inside a given muscle fiber, you have, millions and millions of these together. So even though individually, it may not seem like it's moving that much, right? And so, even from this picture, it seems like, when those things, pull together, they only move just a fraction, a very, very fraction of a micron, right? But when you add all these together, all the millions of different filaments inside your muscles, together they can kind of produce a lot of movement and a lot of force. Okay. And so remember, myosin thick filaments, actin thin filaments, the myosin heads kind of contract and bring the actin closer together. And this is kind of what creates tension forces. All right, any questions on this? Okay. And so one unit like this, and so one kind of combination of actin and myosin together, this is also known as a sarcomere. So a lot of terminology, but that's kind of what biology is to a certain degree. And there's also a name for the part that actually connects the myosin to the actin. And so right where the actin and myosin kind of connect to each other. Draw this color. And so right at the point where the actin and myosin kind of attach, this is known as a cross bridge. And so what I've drawn for you here, this kind of figure, this is kind of you can almost think of it as kind of like the end of the contraction, right? And so once the two actin filaments kind of get really close together, they can overlap a little bit, but they can't overlap too much, right? But in reality, the actin actually start further and further. So there's kind of more action that. All right, question. So do numerous sarcomeres exist inside the muscle fiber? Yes, and so there are lots of sarcomeres that actually exist in the muscle fiber. And so we have lots of sarcomeres that are in series with each other, right? And so all along the muscle fiber, you have all these different sarcomeres linked one another in the end to end. Okay. But there's also a lot of sarcomeres connected in parallel too, right? And so we'll actually talk about, I think not here, but we'll talk about muscle kind of more in depth later in the class. We'll talk about kind of the differences between, what happens when sarcomeres, or what are the effects of sarcomeres linked in series versus parallel. Yeah. Okay. So where was I? Okay, cross bridges. And so question. So does the central big strand of the myosin contract during muscle contraction? Yes. They all contract. And so actually, when I mentioned that there are multiple sarcomeres in parallel, there's not kind of one big strand of myosin. We actually have a lot of myosin kind of lined up in parallel, inside a single muscle fiber. So a muscle fiber consists of lots and lots of these sarcomeres kind of attached in parallel and attached in series. Okay. Cross bridges, right? And so at the cross bridges, the way I've kind of drawn it here, it kind of seems like the actin and myosin are always kind of attached, but that's not always the case. And so the actin, the myosin heads can actually detach from the actin at the side of the cross bridges. And this is actually necessary because if you look at kind of the arrangement of a muscle in its resting length, the actin actually start quite far from each other. So in order to get them to actually come close to each other and overlap, it actually takes several of these kind of myosin head strokes. Okay. So a more accurate picture, would probably look something like this. So you have kind of myosin or actin here, and start kind of falling apart from each other. In the middle, you'd have one continuous myosin in the middle. You have maybe a few that's attached here. You may have a few here that aren't attached to anything. All right, and so let's say that your body needs to undergo movement, or your muscle needs to contract one, right? And so in just one stroke, right? And so if you can imagine all these myosin heads just kind of rotate, rotate this way, okay? And so let's say your muscle needs to generate tension, it needs to shorten by quite a bit, right? But you can see just, because those myosin heads are so small, right, it can't cover that whole distance in just one rotation, right? It's gonna kind of rotate, and that's kind of how far it can go. Okay. And so what happens in this case is that, if your muscle needs to contract more, the myosin heads will rotate as much as it can, but then it'll detach from the actin, it'll rotate back to its original position, and then kind of stroke again, okay? And so what happens there, so let's say that, the myosin, they contract once, and so it brings these a little closer together. Let's say they're all now like this. And so in one rotation, they've kind of pulled the muscle fiber, they pulled the actin filaments as close together as it can, but it can't rotate anymore just because of geometry. And so what it does in this case is that at the cross bridges, okay, the myosin heads will detach here. It'll detach, it'll kind of rotate back to its original position, reattach, and get ready for another stroke. Okay. After detaching, rotating back, it's going to look like this. Maybe different myosin heads are attached now because the actin are in a different position. Right. So now the myosin heads are in a good position to do another rotation, okay? Because they've detached, they found a new attachment point. Okay? And then what it can do here is it can rotate again and then pull the actin closer to. Okay? And so this position is ready for another power stroke. Okay. So one more piece of terminology here for you. So a power stroke is the act of the myosin heads kind of rotating as much as it can. All right. Any questions on this?
Yeah, I was just wondering, if like muscles are getting stretched, like that's muscles, is it that the like actual thing they're getting longer, or is that the fibers themselves are getting?
It's the filaments that are kind of being pulled apart.
Okay, and then is that why overstretching leads to like lack of strength?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, and we'll talk about that kind of when not now. We're gonna come back to muscles kind of midway through the semester, but there's kind of a sweet spot for your muscles where when you have kind of the perfect length of the muscle, that's when it generates the most force. If you kind of overstretch it or if you kind of over compress it, it's not going to be able to generate as much force.
Okay.
Yeah, and it actually has to do with these filaments too, because you want them to be kind of perfectly aligned with, you know, in a configuration like this where the actin are really far from each other. You know, you only have a few myosin heads that are actually able to participate in the power stroke. And so, you know, actually the best configuration for them to actually generate force would be something like this, where all the myosin heads are engaged and they're ready to kind of pull on this muscle. So if it's overstretched, or, you know, like I mentioned, when you kind of compress it too much, then the actins can actually overlap, and you don't engage as many of the myosin. So that leads to less force.
Okay.
Any other questions on this? Okay. All right. So the interesting thing, you know, when you look at kind of the interaction between your muscles and the nervous system, you know, there's almost kind of a one-to-one correlation between a power stroke and a nerve impulse from your brain. And so basically every time your brain sends an impulse to your muscles, that'll create kind of one power stroke, or that'll cause muscles to power stroke. So one impulse, one power stroke. And so what happens, you know, when your muscle needs to do multiple power strokes, right? So let's say you need to perform a big action, right? And so you kind of bring your arms up kind of like that. Right? And so when your muscles need to generate either a longer action or generate more force, the way that your body actually does this is that it sends a volley of signals, right? It doesn't just send one big signal, it sends lots of, you know, impulses at once. All right, so you know, scientists have actually tracked this, right? And so if we kind of draw a graph like this. And so on the horizontal axis, we'll have time. And on the vertical axis, let's say that we're measuring the tension in a single muscle. And so what scientists have done is that they basically kind of detach the muscle from you know, from the organism. And you can actually do this, you can actually run this experiment kind of interestingly enough with even supermarket meat. I remember one time when I was in grad school, I had a colleague that was kind of doing research on this. He went down to the 99 Ranch market and bought chicken hearts, and he was like looking it up to like electrical impulses and was doing experiments like that. And so I was like, wow, that's cool. I wouldn't think to do that with my food, but all right. And so what scientists have found is that if you send a single impulse, I'll make the kind of this part here. If you send just a single electrical impulse or single electrical stimulus to the muscle, it'll generate some tension. But if you don't kind of sustain that, if you don't kind of send more signals, then that actually dies down very quickly, not really generating much force. Right, and so if you want to generate, a larger amount of force over a longer period of time, you need to send kind of multiple impulses. Okay. And so if you actually plot the muscle tension as a function of time, and you kind of time your impulses in a certain way, you actually get a very interesting graph. And so it actually, you'll see it go up. And then let's say that you wait before the next impulse so that it actually starts to go down a little bit. But before it can kind of go down completely, you send the next impulse. Okay. And so it causes a little bit more contraction. Down, maybe it goes up, down, impulse, impulse, another impulse. And so if you time your impulses just right, you can actually see the graph kind of go up and down.
Are they all supposed to be sharp jumps or are they all curves?
There is a little bit of a wind up time, so it's not like an instantaneous reaction in the muscle, because there's some chemical processes that happen within the muscle where it has to release some calcium, and the myosin has to have to actually attach, and then the power stroke actually happens. And so there is actually a time factor. It's not, it happens very quickly. So this everything here is happening probably on the order of milliseconds. But you can actually, but if you have the measurements to actually or instruments to actually measure that with precision, you can actually see it actually take time to go up, take time to go down, and you can actually time this like that. And then eventually, your muscle will reach a state where it can't contract anymore, and so kind of the myosin heads kind of hold the actin so close together that it can't actually shorten anymore, but it'll be kind of in a constant state of tension. And so once you kind of reach that point, and your muscle kind of reaches the maximum amount of tension, we call this state tense. And so once a muscle reaches tetanus, it's not able to generate any more tension, or the amount of tension doesn't go up, but it can just maintain that tension for a moment. And that's basically what happens when you keep stimulating the muscle, you keep sending it impulses, but it's not given a chance to kind of relax. All right. Any questions on this? Okay. All right, so let's talk very briefly about fast twitch muscles and slow twitch muscles. And so all the different muscles in your body, they all kind of serve different purposes, right? And so your leg muscles are going to have a different structure than the muscles in your arms. Because your leg muscles are there to, mostly support your weight, whereas your arm muscles are usually not going to be supporting your unless you work for surface OA or something. But generally speaking, the different parts of your body have different roles, and so the composition of the muscles and how they actually generate tension is going to be different. Okay. And so one way that we can kind of categorize or we can characterize our muscles is by how quickly they can generate the tension once they receive an impulse. And kind of the metric that we use to kind of characterize how quickly they can generate tension is how quickly they can actually do a power trip, right? And so in other words, how quickly the protein filaments can actually slide past each other. So you may have heard these terms before. We have fast twitch and slow twitch muscles. And so fast twitch muscles, or FT, so fast twitch muscles have a kind of a shortening speed of 4.5 sarcomere lengths per second. And then slow twitch muscles, slow twitch muscles have a shortening speed of about 0.86 sarcomere lengths per second. And of course, these are not exact numbers, these are kind of very specific numbers, but these are just kind of based on measurements that scientists have. And so their exact values are not important. What's kind of more important is kind of the, how kind of the difference between the ratio of how quickly, fast twitch muscles act versus slow twitch muscles. And this is not kind of a direct, or I'd say kind of an acute kind of a characterization, right? And so you don't have some muscles that are purely fast twitch or some muscles that are purely slow twitch, right? Most of the muscles in your body kind of have a combination of both fast and slow twitch muscles. And so if you measure kind of a muscle overall, its shortening speed will probably be somewhere in between these two, based on the combination of different fast and slow twitch muscles. But there's a difference in how they act. And so, of course, for the different types of fast twitch and slow twitch, each one is better suited for certain tasks. But fast twitch muscles, because they can react so quickly, they're really well suited for actions that require kind of fast and powerful muscle reactions. Right, so if you look at certain jobs or certain activities that require, fast and powerful, muscle contractions, those kinds of people will have, more fast twitch, right? Because if you look at professional athletes, especially track athletes, and so I think the World Cup of track and field happened recently, and so all those sprinters, those high jumpers, those shot putters, those require very, very powerful movements, and so you're going to see if you, cut those people open, you'll see mostly fast twitch muscles inside their muscles. Right. On the other hand, slow twitch muscles are more well suited for kind of steady, repetitive tasks that don't require a lot of force, but they do need to be maintained over a longer period of time. And so certain parts of the body, just kind of based on what those muscles generally do, will have more capacity. And what's interesting is that this kind of trend is true for other animals as well. Right? And you can actually see, so when people order chicken at a restaurant, they usually ask if you want light meat or dark meat, right? And so the light meat is actually more suited, is more the fast twitch muscles, and the slow twitch muscles are more comprised of the dark. And it has something, and I always forget, it has something to do with kind of the availability of blood and the amount of hemoglobin inside those muscles. Or the dark color in dark meat refers to, or the reason it gets for the colors is because of the hemoglobin inside those muscles. I always forget. I'm pretty sure fast twitch muscles are white meat and then slow twitch muscles are dark meat. But I also get those kind of things. All right. Any questions on this? Yeah. Okay, let's talk about muscle geometry and what effects that has on the amount of force you can actually generate. All right, question. So is there also a difference in terms of the max tension that can be developed between fast twitch and slow twitch muscle? Actually, there's not. And so if you kind of stress both muscles to tetanus, and so you kind of impulse it all the way up till it's its maximum force, there's no difference between fast and slow twitch muscles. It's just kind of how quickly it can get up to that point. That's kind of how you characterize fastness. Yeah. The maximum tension that a muscle can develop actually kind of more depends on its cross-sectional area. And so the more sarcomeres that you have in parallel, that kind of determines how the maximum tension. But in terms of if you kind of tense them over a long period of time, there's no difference. Okay. All right. And so when a muscle develops tension, right, it's important to kind of know kind of the direction in which that tension is generated. And so the direction in which that tension develops is parallel to the muscle fibers. Okay. And so oftentimes, when you see muscles being drawn, it often, we often draw the directions of those fibers, right? And so, let's say that we have bicep muscle here. This. So the muscle fibers are always kind of drawn in with the muscle. Okay. And so when a muscle is drawn like this, we know the force is going to be generated kind of parallel to this, kind of like that. Okay. Parallel to the muscle fibers. And so when you're looking at, how much of this force actually goes into human movement, you kind of need to take into account, the geometry of the joint in which the muscle is acting. Okay. Okay. All right, and so if I take this muscle that I just drew and draw it in its kind of natural environment. So let's look at the biceps muscle in the arm. Remember the bicep muscle, that's kind of the muscle on the top of your upper arms. Okay. Let me go ahead and draw the bones of the arm. Let me do this. Let me draw the bones as rectangles. I'll use a circle to draw the joint. So this right here is your upper arm bones, and this is your humerus. Down here, I've kind of combined, in your lower arm, you have your radius and your ulna. We'll just kind of combine them together. So I'll call this the lower arm. And so the bicep muscle, let's say that it kind of attaches like. And so the force vector, or if we were to draw kind of the direction of the tensile force that the muscle produces, it's going to be parallel to this muscle. So it would be kind of just like that. Okay. But we can also do two. Let's go ahead and characterize this angle. So this angle that it makes with kind of the lower arm bone, we'll call that theta. Okay. And so, when this muscle contracts, right, what we generally expect is that, your entire arm will kind of, flex. Okay. And so once this this muscle contracts, what we describe as the movement of this joint is when this entire kind of lower arm kind of rotates up towards your upper. Another way that we can describe this, right, is that we can say that we have a rotation, right? And so I think that's kind of one thing that I think is kind of difficult to grasp. I think when you're first looking at that, is that when we think of human movement, it's always movement of one body segment relative to another. So it's always a rotation. It's not a linear movement. And so if our movement is characterized by rotation, what that means is that, what we're interested in, when we talk about muscle forces causing movement, is we want to find out how much torque or how much of a moment the muscle is producing around the joint. And so it's more than just the amount of force that it can actually generate. It also depends on the geometry, right? And so it depends not only on its angle, which you can see there, but it's going to depend on how far the muscle kind of attaches away from the. Okay. And so for this particular movement, where we have kind of a rotation around the elbow, right? We need to measure, how far the muscle attaches from the elbow. Okay. For this particular case, okay. And so for this kind of very simple case, the amount of moment is going to be dependent on, of course, it's going to depend on FM. So the more force or the more tension that the muscle can produce, it's going to produce more moment as well. It's going to depend on theta m, which is the attachment angle, and Lm, which is the attachment distance. Okay. All right, and we can actually compute that for this particular one. Okay. And so the amount of torque or the amount of moment that the biceps muscle produces in this case is going to be Fm sine theta m multiplied by L. So in other words, I took the magnitude of the force Fm and I multiplied by the moment on it, which is kind of the perpendicular distance between the joint and the force. Okay. once we start doing kind of static and out, so this is kind of a little bit of a sneak preview of kind of what the next few weeks are gonna be. Gonna be a lot of free body diagrams, it's gonna be a lot of force balances, and a lot of geometry. I think more geometry than I think you will than most people will usually like. But there's actually kind of something that's really important because what we'll see and what we'll talk about in the coming weeks is that not 100% of the muscle force actually goes into rotating the body part. Some of that muscle force actually goes straight into the joint. And so a lot of times, your muscles are arranged in a certain way where when you contract the muscle, a component of that muscle force actually goes into kind of pushing your joints together, right? And sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it provides your joint stability because it kind of pushes the bones together, so it makes it less likely to dislocate. So that's kind of important in your shoulder. But sometimes it can also be a bad thing too, because if you kind of put excessive force on your joints, it can cause some kind of issues there as well. And so when we talk about kind of posture and kind of your back, that's something that's really important. Because when people say they have back problems or they have sore lower back because of their posture, posture actually causes your back muscles to kind of compensate to keep your balance. But because your back muscles are kind of acting so much, it puts a lot of pressure on your spine that it causes things like hernias and sore backs. Okay, but we'll become very well acquainted. If you did want to kind of introduce this now, as we're kind of talk about this. All right, any questions on this? Okay, all right. One last thing I want to talk about today, which is characterizing kind of the movement of muscles relative to its direction of tension. All right, so we have three kind of distinctions here. So we have concentric, we call concentric contraction. And so concentric contraction is when the primary muscle torque, or the torque that's produced by your muscle, is greater than all the torques that are resisting. Okay? In other words, the muscle is short. Okay? So most muscle contraction are kind of when people, kind of imagine that they're contracting their muscles. Most of the time, you're going to have concentric contraction, right? So if I want to flex at the elbow, right, then my biceps are contracting, right? And because of all the resisting force, everything that's kind of pushing my elbow in the opposite direction is kind of weak, right? When I flex my elbow and my bicep muscle shortens, that's known as concentric contraction. So in other words, the movement is in the same direction as the tension. That's what you can think of for a concentric. All right, number two, we have isometric contraction. Isometric contraction is actually when there's no movement. So when the primary muscle torque that's produced by your muscles is the same as all the resistive torques and no movement response. All right, so you may, if you're into working out, you may have heard the term isometric workouts, right? And so those are workouts when you kind of you're flexing your muscles, you're kind of applying force, but no movement is occurring, right? And so one exercise, you kind of put your hands together, you kind of push your hands together as hard as you can, right? You're still getting an exercise, you're still getting a workout, your muscles are still kind of contracting, but no movement is occurring because all the forces are occurring. All right, and then the last type of movement that we can have is called eccentric contraction. By process of elimination, probably you can kind of write this definition here. What happens when the primary muscle torque is less than the resistive torques, causing muscle movement in the opposite direction. All right, eccentric contraction usually occurs when you're trying to kind of slow something down or act as kind of like a resistance. Okay? And so I think the most common case for this is, so let's say that you jump down from a high location, right? And so what they always tell you when you jump down from a really high location, you probably need to try to land on your butt. But if you land on your feet, what happens is that you don't land with stiff feet, right? If you land with stiff feet, that's a very quick way to break your legs. And so what you do then is you kind of you put some slack in your legs, and you kind of let your muscle kind of soften and flow. So even though your calf muscle, your quadricep muscle, they're pushing, right? Your body's actually moving down, even though they're providing the force. Eccentric contraction is what happens when you provide kind of that resistive force to kind of stop a movement rather than cause. All right, any final questions on this? Okay, all right, so that's all I have to say for muscles. There is more to these lecture notes, but we're going to revisit muscles later in the semester, and just because we had the day off on Monday, we'll have it here. And so if you read the lecture notes on muscles, you'll see that there is more there, but we'll kind of revisit it. We'll come back on Monday. We'll talk about these, how those act in the body, and then I think probably later we'll start to go to again. All right, so thank you guys for coming today. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. I will see you on Monday. Yes, go ahead and, well, I mean, we went over this today, so you can get pretty mad, but I'm only gonna trade with them. I got that summer papers on that stuff. I was gonna look into it. So you'll see that. Okay.
I don't like touch back.
I think I gave everyone credit for it, so if you check out Canvas. Oh, yeah, oh, that's fine, yeah. Yeah, it's just, there's so many, so I actually get a chance to answer. Oh, no, yeah, just to get a chance. I marked it down, this, I think there was a day where like I had a lot of meetings, so I just kind of marked them as read and gave them credit. I didn't have to. Yeah.
Need to make your.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. Oh, yeah, that's fine, because it's just the. Okay, yeah, there's
like make changes.
yeah, as long as I can read it and I can kind of follow it, that's fine. But there's no limit, right? Yeah.
Submit on the Canvas portal, right?
Yes, yeah.
Thank
I
you.
have a question that's like kind of related. I was wondering, do you know if muscles can grow from trauma? Like, if like they're hit repeatedly, does that cause them to grow as well? Or is that a separate?
That's a good question, actually. They do respond to that, and so they get bruised and kind of repair themselves. But whether they can actually grow from that is I guess it does, because when you work out and you kind of, you know, and you're kind of pushing your muscles, you kind of cause, people would say you tear your muscles, you don't actually tear your muscles, you kind of cause kind of more micro injuries that the muscles kind of refill with kind of more protein fluids. And so in theory, I guess you can kind of strengthen your muscles in that way too. But I don't know if I'm not sure if it actually triggers the same kind of biological response. I'd have to kind of look that up and kind of get back to you. In theory, I would say yes, but I'm not sure if kind of the nature of the injury would be different than kind of, you know, when you normally just work out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, any final questions? Okay, all right, I will see you next week.